I used to think silence was the only way to keep peace in my family. Every time my father mocked me for never making something of myself, I smiled. Every holiday, my sister took the seat of pride while I stayed in the corner, invisible but useful, the one who remembered birthdays, who fixed what broke, who never asked for credit. For years, I told myself it didn't matter, that being unseen was safer than being misunderstood. But that night, when my mother laughed along with them, pretending I wasn't standing 3 feet away, something in me shifted. It wasn't anger that rose first. It was clarity. I realized I'd mistaken endurance for acceptance, and silence for grace. So I stopped trying to belong, because some truths don't need to be shouted to break the world apart. They only need to be spoken once. The road curved along the edge of the gulf, where the air always carried a hint of salt and something heavier, memory. The palms bent slightly with the wind, as if bowing to the years I had stayed away. 25 years, long enough to build a life far from this coast, long enough to forget the sound of this place, until it all came rushing back the moment I crossed the bridge into Clearwater Bay. The resort came into view like a mirage. White columns, gold light spilling from the glass doors, the smell of perfume and polished marble already seeping through the air. Seaside Horizon. I'd seen its name in the reunion invitation months ago and almost thrown it away. But here I was, idling in the parking lot, my hand frozen on the steering wheel, staring at the building that once belonged to my classmates' families, the kind of place I could never afford growing up. Inside, laughter hit me before the air conditioning did. The lobby glittered with chandeliers and the sound of a jazz trio near the bar. A banner hung across the ballroom entrance. Lakeview Academy. 25 years later. It was the same school that had taught us to measure success in titles and appearances. I guess some lessons stay. The first thing I noticed was how loudly everyone spoke. The louder the voice, the more expensive the outfit, it seemed. Groups formed in tight circles, bankers, attorneys, doctors, each one trying to outshine the next. I walked past them unnoticed, until a perfume I remembered from another lifetime brushed my shoulder. Adeline Porter? That voice. I turned and found Clara Maynard, Lakeview's golden girl turned politician, smiling at me with the warmth of a camera flash. Her hair was perfectly set, the pearls at her neck almost glowing under the chandelier. "Well," she said, wrapping me in an embrace that never touched her eyes. "You haven't changed a bit. Still so practical." A ripple of laughter followed her words from the circle behind her. The same tone I remembered from senior year, sweet on the surface, sharp underneath. I smiled back because some wars weren't worth fighting on public ground. "Some of us still find comfort in simplicity," I said. Her smile stiffened for half a second before she turned to introduce me. Senator Clara Maynard of Florida. Every word from her mouth seemed rehearsed for applause. A few heads nodded politely in my direction before drifting elsewhere. No one really asked what I did or where I'd been. I was the quiet one again, the one who didn't quite fit the narrative of success that filled the room. At the main table, I spotted James Carter. He was standing in the center of his own audience, recounting a story about his latest project. His voice carried that same charming arrogance it always had. When his eyes found me, recognition flickered, then that smirk. "Adeline Porter," he said loudly, as if testing the name. "She once swore she'd change the world. Guess the world's still waiting." Laughter rippled across the room again. Even Clara covered her mouth like it was the most delightful thing she'd ever heard. I lifted my glass toward him and smiled back. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence unsettles people more than anger ever could. I found a seat near the back of the room, at a small table meant for the unremarkable and forgotten. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and I sat quietly, watching the faces I once knew reflected in the golden light. They hadn't changed much, still proud, still certain, still convinced that success was measured by how many people were watching. My glass caught the light when I lifted it, and for a moment, I saw my own reflection, older, steadier, harder to read. I wasn't the same girl they remembered. Not even close. I took a sip. The wine tasted metallic, too sweet to be honest. Then, a vibration in my purse. One short buzz, too precise to be random. I froze. When I slid my hand inside, my fingers brushed against the familiar weight of a secure device. The small screen blinked once, green, then amber. My breath caught before I even looked. Sky Vault Command. Priority 1. For 17 years. I hadn't seen that phrase. I set the glass down carefully, as if any sound might draw eyes my way. Around me, the laughter blurred into noise. My pulse synced with the hum of the chandelier. Something in the air shifted. After all this time, after all the years I'd spent pretending to be ordinary, my world was reaching for me again. I closed my eyes, and for a heartbeat, I wasn't in that ballroom anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere dust choked the sky, and silence meant survival. When I opened them, the ballroom was still there. Clara was still laughing too loud. James was still playing the crowd, and no one had noticed that I'd gone completely still. I slipped the device back into my purse and exhaled. Whatever this was, it wasn't a coincidence. The past has a way of finding you when you've convinced yourself it never will. I stood up, straightened my navy dress, and walked toward the terrace. From there, I could see the water, dark, endless, waiting. The wind had changed direction. I didn't know it yet, but so had everything else. The ballroom lights dimmed to a soft gold as the MC's voice echoed over the speakers, announcing the highlight of the evening. Clara stepped onto the small stage in a sapphire dress that shimmered like authority itself. The applause was instant, practiced, the kind reserved for someone who had already won before she even spoke. Her voice cut through the noise, bright, polished, dripping with ease. She started with nostalgia, the kind that makes people lean in, makes them forget how long it's been since they cared about anyone in this room. She said she remembered our senior year at Lakeview Academy, when we wrote in the yearbook that we'd serve our country someday. Then she smiled, the smile of someone who'd never known defeat. I still remember her exact words. She said she had done just that, stayed here, fought for her community, stood by her principles. She said she was proud to still be fighting. The applause that followed was warm and heavy, filling the ballroom until it felt suffocating. The sound pressed against my chest like a weight. Then she looked down from the stage, her eyes catching mine for just a fraction too long. The pause was deliberate. The smile was not kind. Some people, she said, choose different paths, and that's what makes life interesting. A few polite laughs fluttered through the room, the kind of laughter that asks permission. I didn't move. My fingers stayed wrapped around the stem of my glass, knuckles pale. She turned her gaze away, scanning the crowd as if she hadn't just taken a scalpel to the air between us. The music shifted, the lights brightened, conversations resumed. But my head wasn't in Clearwater Bay anymore. It was 2004 again, a sterile conference room at the Pentagon. The day I found out my nomination for the Legion of Merit had been withdrawn without explanation. I'd spent years trying not to remember that day, the smell of burnt coffee, the static hum of the fluorescent lights, the officer who couldn't meet my eyes when he told me. He'd said, "It wasn't a mistake, ma'am." Someone higher up pulled it. Weeks later, a young lieutenant, one I'd mentored, slipped me a message through a coded channel, a copy of the withdrawal email. It had come from the advisory board, sent under the personal authority of Clara Maynard. I'd stared at her name on that document for hours. The same name I'd once signed next to in every student council memo, every project submission, every team competition. She'd taken what should have been an acknowledgement of my team's sacrifice and erased it without a word. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that medals were metal and integrity was something quieter. I'd convinced myself that forgetting was strength, but sitting there now, under that same kind of light, hearing her voice, confident, flawless, cheered, I realized memory doesn't fade when injustice still breathes. It waits. Clara finished her speech with a practiced humility, promising to continue serving the people of Florida. More applause, more camera flashes. When she stepped off the stage, she was radiant. People reached out to shake her hand, like pilgrims touching a relic. She moved through the crowd, smiling, thanking, posing. Then, as if she had all night, she came to me. "Adeline," she said softly, her tone coated in honey. "You were so quiet during my speech. You always were the quiet one, weren't you?" She reached for the bottle on the table and poured more wine into my glass, though I hadn't asked. Her bracelet clicked against the rim, a small metallic sound that made the hairs on my neck rise. "I heard you've been doing some sort of consulting work," she continued. "Security, wasn't it? That sounds thrilling. I hope it's nothing too dangerous." Her eyes lingered, searching for something behind my face. There was no curiosity in her tone, only a calculated gentleness, the kind that hides a blade. I smiled just enough. "Danger," I said, "is usually just part of the job." The corner of her mouth twitched into that same metallic grin I remembered from high school debates, the one she wore right before twisting someone's words in front of an audience. She tilted her glass toward mine. "Well, some of us were always made for quieter kinds of service, weren't we?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't answer it. I let the silence sit between us, solid and unmoving. Around us, the laughter resumed, and the band picked up another tune. But it all blurred into background noise. The champagne, the perfume, the clinking of silverware. What I heard instead was the quiet hum of memory sharpening itself, like steel sliding against steel. Clara excused herself a minute later, drawn back toward the light and the cameras, where she belonged. I watched her go, the crowd parting for her like water. People saw the senator, the leader, the woman of purpose. I saw something else. The girl who used to copy my speeches, who'd whispered once that she wanted to be remembered no matter what it took. And suddenly I knew. She hadn't changed. The same ambition, the same hunger to stand higher, even if she had to step over someone else to get there. I turned the stem of my glass slowly between my fingers, the reflection of the chandelier splintering across the surface. For years I had convinced myself that forgetting was peace, that forgiveness was wisdom, but peace built on silence rots from the inside. I set the glass down and leaned back, feeling the pulse at my wrist steady itself. Across the room, Clara laughed again, hand pressed to her chest as though she were flattered by the world itself. She had taken something from me once, something that couldn't be replaced or returned. But I'd learned long ago that time has a strange way of restoring balance. When she glanced my way again, her expression was all smiles and civility, but there was something different in her eyes, something calculating, aware. She knew I remembered. She just didn't know what that meant yet. The music rose, drowning everything else. I lifted my glass again, pretending to drink. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I felt the sharp, quiet certainty of an old truth returning. Some debts don't vanish with time. They wait for the right silence to break. The music inside had grown louder, a cascade of brass and laughter that no longer sounded human. I slipped through the open doors onto the terrace, grateful for the cold air. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, black and still, swallowing the moonlight in long silver ripples. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the salt wind sting my eyes. Then came the voice I'd hoped to avoid. James stepped out behind me, his tie loose, a half-smile clinging to his face. He held his drink like it was part of him, something to hide behind, something to lean on. Still the same, I thought. Still the kind of man who couldn't stand silence unless it belonged to him. He stopped beside me, shoulder to shoulder, close enough to smell the bourbon on his breath. "So," he said, "you're still working for the government? I heard you're teaching tactics for the reserves now or something." I watched the horizon instead of him, the way the dark met the darker line of the sea. My reflection flickered in the glass door, a ghost caught between two worlds. "I still work," I said, but no one ever really knows what I do." He laughed softly, not unkindly, but sharp enough to draw blood. "That's your problem, Adeline. Always hiding, always keeping secrets. Life doesn't have to be a mission." He said it like a joke, but the words landed heavier than he knew, because for some people, life had been a mission, one they never got to finish. I didn't answer. I just let the wind fill the space between us. He shifted, waiting for something I wouldn't give. When he finally went back inside, I exhaled slowly, the way I used to after long deployments, steady, measured, waiting for my heart to remember how to beat at a normal pace. The terrace fell quiet again, only the waves below, breaking softly against the rocks, and somewhere far off, a buoy light flickering red. The air tasted of salt and rust, and then, like a switch thrown in my mind, the past started to bleed through the present. Afghanistan, 2011. The operation we called Artemis Rift. The memory came in fragments. The night sky over the desert, static crackling in my headset, the scent of sand oil and gunpowder. 3 soldiers from my unit, gone within minutes, because someone had leaked our coordinates. I could still hear the final transmission, a voice half cut by interference. "We've been exposed. Someone sold us out. They never made it home." And afterward, when the Pentagon reviewed the incident, they called it an unfortunate systems failure. That's what they wrote in the report. Failure. But I knew better. It wasn't the system that failed. It was trust. That night, I made myself a promise. No politics would ever touch the names of the people I'd lost. No one would rewrite what they died for. And if it meant living quietly, out of sight, I would. The cold crept deeper into my hands. I set the empty glass down on the railing, watching the condensation trail along its edge. Somewhere inside, the laughter swelled again, a room full of people congratulating themselves for being seen. My phone buzzed once. I ignored it. Then again, harder. The third vibration didn't stop. I pulled it from my clutch, shielding the screen from the wind. A single line of encrypted code blinked, turning from green to red. The text unfolded with mechanical precision. "Aurora Defense Net, breach detected. Potential insider link, Maynard, C." For a second, I thought it was a glitch. My brain refused to process it. Then I read it again. Maynard, C. Clara, the same woman who had smiled across the ballroom not an hour ago, basking in applause, spinning stories about service and loyalty. Her name, her exact signature, was inside a classified defense network breach. My breath caught, then slowed, dropping into the deep calm I hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes when instinct takes over and emotion steps aside. I stood there, staring at the screen, while the tide crashed far below. Every sound seemed distant. The muffled beat of the jazz band, the hum of voices, the low drone of the air conditioning through the glass. The message didn't lie. It never did. Skyvault's alerts were reserved for priority threats, level 1, only when national security was at stake. It had been 17 years since the last one carried my clearance. Now, out of nowhere, my codename had been reactivated. I clenched my hand around the phone until the edges bit into my skin. Clara Maynard, the senator, the woman who had publicly mocked me for vanishing, who once erased my name from a commendation and called it a clerical error. Her name was sitting inside a national defense breach. Some things aren't coincidences. I looked back through the ballroom doors. Clara stood under the chandelier again, radiant and surrounded, her laugh rising above the others like music she'd rehearsed. The same precision, the same control. And just like that, I understood. The recall signal from Skyvault, the one I'd received in the ballroom earlier, wasn't random. It was an activation order. They'd pulled me out of civilian silence because the threat was internal, because of her. A gust of wind caught the hem of my dress, pulling me forward a step. I steadied myself against the railing, eyes still fixed on the reflection of the ballroom inside the glass. All those people, drunk on nostalgia and ego, had no idea that somewhere within their ranks, something far larger was unraveling. I felt the weight of the years between then and now press into my chest. Every promise I'd made, every ghost I carried, the mission I thought I'd left behind had found me again. And this time, it had a name. The waves below crashed louder. My phone vibrated once more, the code confirming my reactivation sequence. Level 1 authority. Skyvault, active status. I slipped the device back into my clutch, my pulse steady now. The decision already made. Whatever this was, it wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility, about the vow I'd made in a foreign desert under the cover of static and loss. I turned toward the ballroom, the light washing over me again as I stepped inside. The laughter met me like a wall, bright and oblivious. Clara caught my eye across the room and raised her glass. Smiling, graceful, untouchable. I smiled back. The music swelled. The past and present finally caught each other in the same breath. This time, I wasn't walking away. The ballroom had changed while I was gone. The music had softened into something nostalgic, strings and brass from another decade, and people had drifted closer together, as if the warmth of their success could be shared just by standing near it. I lingered at the edge of the room, watching them. Every face was lit with a kind of self-satisfaction that only comes from being seen. Clara stood at the center of it all. The crowd parted naturally around her, every movement perfectly timed, every smile ready for a camera. She was talking about her re-election campaign, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of performance. The words were smooth, polished, hollow. She said she'd never stopped serving the people. She said service was her calling. And as she spoke, I couldn't help but remember another stage, another crowd. Graduation, 1999. I was standing beside her back then, the sun blazing against the fabric of our caps, the smell of salt in the air. I'd been called up for the West Point scholarship, and she for most likely to succeed. I still remember the way she turned toward me, that sharp smile, her lips barely moving as she whispered that one day, people would remember her name more than mine. Now, as she basked under the ballroom lights, she was right. They did. I moved toward the bar, needing something colder than the room. The bartender was busy, so I reached for a glass of water from the tray of a passing waiter. He hesitated when he saw me, scanning the seating chart pinned to his cuff. "Sorry." "Ma'am, are you a guest of someone?" "I don't see your name on the VIP list." I looked at him, his youth, his nervousness, his need to keep things in their neat little boxes. "I'm here on an old invitation," I said quietly. "Maybe they've just forgotten me." He flushed, murmured an apology, and hurried off. The water was lukewarm. Still, it helped. I stood there, half in shadow, half in the golden haze of chandeliers, letting the chatter fade into a low hum. When I turned, James was walking toward me. His hands were in his pockets, the way they always were when he had something to say he wasn't sure he should. He stopped a few steps away. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the joke earlier. I didn't think it would come off that way." "It's fine," I said. "People can only touch what you still care about." He nodded slowly, studying me, as if he was seeing a version of me he couldn't quite recognize. Then he glanced around, lowering his voice. "You're not going to tell anyone what you actually do, are you? You've done things, haven't you? Big things?" I met his eyes, steady. "Not everything needs to be said. James, some things lose their truth the moment you speak them." He gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Still the same, huh?" "Always a riddle wrapped in a secret, maybe," I said. "But not the same reason as before." He looked as though he wanted to say more, but someone called his name from across the room, and he left with a small wave. The moment he disappeared into the crowd, the air shifted again, as if something unseen had drawn closer. I turned toward the windows. Beyond the glass, the sea stretched wide and black, its surface so calm it looked solid. But in the far distance, clouds were gathering, layered and heavy. Lightning flashed faintly on the horizon, far enough to be silent, close enough to make my pulse change rhythm. My phone buzzed against the table. Once, then twice. I didn't move right away. When I finally reached for it, the screen lit up with a coded sequence I hadn't seen in years. Authorization Protocol, Aurora Incident Level 1. ETA Extraction, 8 minutes. The message burned into my mind. 8 minutes. My fingers tightened around the phone. The noise of the room felt distant now, muffled, as if I were standing behind a wall of glass. The old instincts, the ones I'd buried, kicked in before I could stop them. My breath slowed. The air around me sharpened. Extraction meant a team was already inbound. Level 1 meant classified breach, national scale. I looked out through the window again. The clouds over the water were closer now, rolling faster, edges flashing with silver. I could almost hear the low hum of approaching wind. Though maybe it was just in my chest, the irony wasn't lost on me. Standing in a room full of people obsessed with recognition, while the world I'd lived in for decades operated on being unseen. Inside, the laughter swelled again. Clara's voice carried above it, full of confidence, rehearsed and radiant. She was telling a story about a bill she'd passed, about fighting for what mattered, about integrity. Every syllable felt like a dare. I set my glass down, feeling the condensation slip across my fingertips. My heart had already decided what came next, even before my mind caught up. Outside, thunder cracked somewhere beyond the shore. Inside, the chandeliers flickered just slightly, enough for a few people to glance up. I slipped my phone back into my bag and straightened the hem of my dress. The message was clear. I was being called in, and whatever storm was coming wasn't just in the sky. As I started toward the exit, James turned from across the room. His eyes met mine, questioning, uncertain. I held his gaze for a breath longer than I should have, long enough for him to know I wasn't just leaving a party. The music rose again, drowning the sound of the sea outside. I stepped into the corridor, my heels clicking against the marble floor, steady and deliberate. Somewhere above the waves, a low mechanical hum began to build, barely audible yet distinct, slicing through the night air. The kind of sound that most people would mistake for wind. I knew better. The countdown had already started. The air in the ballroom shifted before anyone noticed it. The kind of shift that doesn't come from temperature or sound, but from pressure. Something unseen pushing against the walls, waiting to break through. I felt it first, like the faint tightening of gravity before a storm. The curtains near the main doors stirred. A gust of wind slipped through the small cracks, cold enough to cut through perfume and laughter. The chandeliers swayed almost imperceptibly. Someone laughed too loudly, trying to drown the discomfort. Clara was on stage again, mic in hand, her voice lilting above the noise. She announced that it was time for the class photo, her words drenched in charm. Then, with that same performative ease she'd mastered years ago, she raised her glass high. "Let's toast," she said, "to those who kept their promise to serve, even if only in memory." The laughter that followed was bright and ugly. I set my drink down slowly. The condensation left a ring on the white linen, perfect and still. I stood up, smoothing the hem of my navy dress. The air grew heavier, as if the building itself had started to hold its breath. Another gust slammed through the open doors. The curtains blew inward like startled birds. A murmur rippled through the room. Glasses trembled. And then, that sound. Low at first, a deep mechanical pulse, distant but unmistakable. The kind of sound that lived beneath the earth. The kind that made your bones remember something before your brain did. Someone near the window frowned. Another person turned toward the beachside lawn. Then a shout. "A helicopter! There's a helicopter!" The music died mid-note. Chairs scraped back. People rushed toward the terrace, the sound swelling now, louder, closer, beating like a second heart. The first blast of air hit as the rotor wash rolled across the lawn, scattering napkins, leaves, sand. The chandeliers rattled. Someone screamed when a tablecloth caught the wind and tore free. A woman's champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering at her feet. Outside, the searchlight cut through the night. The beams swept over sequined gowns and startled faces, over hands shielding eyes and hair whipping across cheeks. I already knew who they were there for. The side door of the helicopter slid open. The sound of the rotors beat like thunder against the sea. Out of the glare stepped a figure in a dark flight suit, insignia gleaming at the shoulders. Even from this distance, I recognized the steady way he walked, unbothered by the chaos. Colonel Marcus Hale. He moved through the wind as if he commanded it. When he reached the edge of the crowd, he raised his hand to his headset. His voice, amplified through a portable comm speaker, boomed clear and formal. Lieutenant General Adeline Porter, ma'am. The Pentagon requests your immediate presence. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Every sound vanished. Every face turned toward me. For a moment, time fractured. The laughter, the music, the years I had spent pretending to be ordinary, all shattering in one breath. I stood in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by people who had forgotten me, mocked me, written their own versions of who I used to be. The wind from the rotors caught the hem of my dress, lifting it slightly. The spotlight spilled across me, bright and merciless. Clara stood frozen at the front, her glass of champagne trembling in her hand. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. Adeline, what are you? I met her eyes. My voice was steady. The same tone I'd used years ago, giving orders over the radio while the world burned around me. You can call me whatever you like, but out there, they call me teammate. Marcus stepped forward through the wind and handed me a sealed folder stamped with the Pentagon crest. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but his voice carried an edge of urgency. Aurora breach confirmed. Data link traced to a member of the Senate Defense Committee. I nodded once. The message clear? No surprise? No shock? Just confirmation. Tell command I'll report in 15 minutes. He saluted sharply, then turned toward the helicopter. Waiting. Behind me. Someone whispered my name like a prayer. James. He pushed through the stunned crowd until he stood a few steps away. Face pale. Eyes searching mine. Adeline! Wait! I didn't turn fully, only half glanced at him over my shoulder. I used to think love made people brave, I said quietly, but sometimes it just teaches them how to stay silent at the wrong moment. The words hung in the air between us, too soft to echo, too sharp to ignore. I stepped past him and walked toward the open doors. The wind hit harder now, carrying salt and sand and the distant roar of the sea. My hair whipped across my face, the sound of the rotors growing deafening. As I reached the edge of the terrace, I caught one last glimpse of the ballroom, of Clara, standing rigid, her white dress splattered with spilled champagne that looked too much like blood under the strobe of the searchlight. Her hand trembled, her mask finally slipping. I climbed into the helicopter, gripping the metal rail as the engines surged. Marcus closed the door behind me, the cabin filled with vibration, the smell of jet fuel thick and familiar. Through the glass, I saw the crowd shrinking, the ballroom fading into a blur of gold and chaos. Clara was still standing there, unmoving, her glass shattered at her feet. As we lifted off, the noise below dissolved into a hum, swallowed by the sea wind. The city lights stretched beneath us, scattered like embers. I felt the vibration through the soles of my shoes, the steady rhythm of a machine that only knew one direction. Forward. For the first time in years, my chest felt light, not because I was being called back into duty, but because I no longer had to pretend. The lie had finally peeled away, leaving only what was real. I looked out the window at the horizon, where the storm clouds gathered, their edges glowing faintly in the night. Somewhere inside that storm was the truth waiting to be faced, and for the first time, I wasn't running from it. The helicopter climbed higher, slicing through the dark. Below us, Clearwater Bay was nothing but fractured light and memory. By the time I crossed the Florida border, the world had already decided who I was. My phone pulsed nonstop, messages, notifications, calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The moment I connected to the base network in Tampa, the secure line lit up like a warning flare. Someone had uploaded the footage, the helicopter landing, the searchlight cutting through the night, me standing in the center of it, hair whipped by the wind, eyes forward. They gave it a name, the Silent General. Within hours, it was everywhere. News anchors replayed the clip in slow motion, analyzing every frame as though it were a state secret. Commentators called it symbolic. Critics called it staged. Social media called it war. At 3 a.m., I sat in my quarters, the only light coming from the screen in front of me. The hum of the servers in the adjoining control room was steady and low, like a mechanical heartbeat. On one side of the feed, she's an American hero. On the other, no one's heard of her before. What is she hiding? Between them, 100 versions of me, each twisted, dissected, remade by strangers who wanted to believe in something or destroy it. By morning, I didn't need to check the news to know Clara had spoken. Her voice was everywhere. I turned on CNN anyway, knowing the ritual of confrontation couldn't be avoided forever. There she was, center frame, perfect lighting, the navy blue backdrop carefully chosen to echo the color of authority. Her hair was tied back in a way meant to suggest discipline. Her makeup, restraint. Adeline Porter was my classmate. She said, her tone heavy with empathy. I've always admired her courage, but sometimes people become so enamored with their own mythology that they lose sight of what's real. The public deserves truth, not hero worship. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Soft, reasonable, impossible to refute without looking defensive. I stared at her face on the screen. The subtle tilt of her head when she said my name. The practiced sadness behind her eyes. I'd seen that performance before, back when she wanted something she didn't deserve. I muted the volume. The silence was easier to bear than the noise of hypocrisy, by noon. The silent myth was trending across every platform. My face, lit by the helicopter's white beam, had become a meme. Some used it to praise discipline, others to mock ego. Comment threads bled into political rants, gender wars, conspiracy theories. People who had never met me, never served a day, never lost anyone to friendly fire or betrayal, spoke about me as if they'd read my soul. And somewhere in all that noise, the truth was already being rewritten. When Marcus came into the office, he didn't knock. He set a cup of black coffee beside me, the steam curling in the cold fluorescent light. His uniform looked like it had been slept in. "They want you to keep quiet," he said. "Pentagon's issuing a statement. No comment on personnel currently under classified review." I leaned back in the chair. So they get to say whatever they want, and I'm supposed to stay silent? For now, yes. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. I've been silent for 25 years. Marcus, if I stay quiet again, they'll write history with someone else's mouth. He rubbed the back of his neck. You know what you're up against, right? This isn't a battlefield you can see. I looked at the wall of screens, the map overlays, the encrypted feeds, the coded alerts blinking red and amber. It never is. When he left, I turned back to the secure network, the only space where truth still obeyed logic. The SkyVault interface loaded, each layer of clearance sliding open like a lock being picked. A new message pulsed at the top of the screen. Aurora. Internal review pending. I clicked it open. The words came in clean, bureaucratic lines. Possible leak originating within the Senate Defense Subcommittee. At the bottom, a small signature code. C. Maynard. Committee member. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The noise outside the office faded. The hum of the servers became distant. My reflection stared back at me from the screen. Expressionless, but my pulse had already found its rhythm. Slow, cold, certain. Clara's speech on television wasn't coincidence. It was preemption. She'd moved first, painted herself in the colors of virtue before the storm reached her. She knew something was coming, and now I knew why. Everything connected in a perfect, poisonous circle. The deleted citation years ago, the false humility at the reunion, the way she had smiled when she mentioned danger, as if she already knew what my world contained. And now her name was buried inside a classified breach. I exhaled through my teeth. The air in the room felt metallic. The screen blinked once more. An automated ping from Central Command requesting confirmation of receipt. I entered my authentication code, then locked the terminal. For years, I'd believed that silence protected people, that staying in the shadows kept the system stable, the truth safe. But the system was never safe. It was built on the illusion that truth could survive without defenders. Outside, I heard the distant echo of aircraft moving across the base, routine, controlled. Nothing like the chaos of Clearwater Bay. Yet even in that steady sound, something restless stirred. Clara had started a war she didn't understand. Not of weapons, but of words. The kind that burned slower and cut deeper. And this time, I wasn't going to let her write the ending. I shut off the monitor. The room went dark, leaving only the faint glow of the city lights bleeding through the blinds. I leaned back, hands clasped, listening to the steady thrum of the machines around me, the same machines that had carried the whispers of every mission, every code, every life once trusted to the chain of command. Now, they carried her name, and mine. The world outside was screaming for explanations, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel like explaining. The truth didn't need permission to exist. It only needed someone willing to face the fire. 3 days later, I was summoned to Tampa Air Command. The air in the briefing room was cold and metallic, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones before you even sit down. The fluorescent lights hummed above, washing every face pale. The walls were bare except for a single flag and a digital screen flickering with the Aurora Systems network map. General Collins sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his tone clipped to efficiency. "We can't let this touch Congress," he said flatly. "You understand me, Porter?" I nodded once. I understand, but I don't agree. His jaw tightened, just enough for me to know I'd stepped on a fault line. Marcus stood behind me, silent, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. The others shifted in their seats, more uncomfortable with my composure than my defiance. I tapped the screen in front of me, pulling up the Aurora access log. Points of intrusion glowed red against the dark grid, each one pulsing faintly, coordinates, times, and clearance IDs. One entry near the top blinked slower than the rest. Main 12. Collins leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What exactly am I looking at?" "That," I said, "is a traced internal access key. It corresponds to a member of the Senate Defense Subcommittee. Specifically—" "Don't say it." He cut in. His tone wasn't sharp, but final. "Clara Maynard." I finished anyway. The room went still. The faint hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. "You don't have authorization to pursue a civilian of her rank," Collins said finally. "She's a sitting member of the Senate. You know what that means." "It means she has clearance," I said. "Not immunity." His gaze hardened. "This isn't your jurisdiction. Porter, you are a symbol, not a political instrument." The word symbol landed like an insult. I kept my tone steady. "With all due respect, sir, national security doesn't end where politics begins." His hand came down on the table, flat, loud, controlled fury disguised as discipline. "You will not escalate this. That's an order." There it was again. Order. As if the truth could be deferred by rank. I didn't argue. I just looked at him until the silence between us became too heavy to hold. Then I gathered my files, locked the tablet, and stood. Marcus followed me out, wordless. Outside, the Florida sky was gray and restless, thunder crawling along the horizon. That night, the rain came. It battered the windows of my quarters in sharp, uneven bursts, the kind that makes sleep impossible. I sat at my desk, staring at the unopened files on my screen, listening to the rhythm of the storm. When the knock came, it was past midnight. Not loud, 3 short taps, deliberate. I opened the door to find no one there, only a padded envelope on the step, rainwater bleeding through the edges. My name was written in ink, no rank, no title, Just Adeline. Inside was a single flash drive, wrapped in plastic. A note was tucked beside it, the handwriting quick and slanted, from someone who still owes you a life. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stared at the words, the ink blurring slightly where the rain had touched it. Then I slid the drive into my encrypted terminal. The screen flickered. A video file appeared, unmarked, time-stamped 2 days ago. The footage was grainy, shot from a hidden angle. I recognized the office immediately, the private conference room of the Senate Defense Subcommittee. Clara sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her voice calm. Across from her was Daniel Creed, her senior political advisor, the same man who'd been orchestrating her press appearances. Creed leaned in, voice low but distinct. "If the Aurora breach gets out, you'll lose your committee seat, maybe your entire career." Clara didn't even blink. "Then we do what they do best, redirect. Let them believe Porter leaked it. She's already an enigma, and the silent ones are always the easiest to doubt." Creed laughed softly. "You're playing with fire." Clara smiled, the same polished, deliberate smile she'd worn on camera. Fire's only dangerous when you forget who's holding the match. The file ended there. I sat motionless for a long time, the rain still tapping against the glass like distant artillery. My hand clenched around the edge of the desk, knuckles white. The memory came uninvited. A desert night years ago. 3 of my soldiers gone because someone had sold us out. And now, a senator doing the same thing. Not for ideology or survival, but for optics. Outside, lightning cracked, washing the room in brief, blinding white. This wasn't about recognition anymore. It wasn't about restoring what had been taken from me. It was about stopping a lie before it rewrote another piece of history. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. He answered on the second ring. "It's late," he said. "I know. We're going to internal affairs in the morning." There was a pause. He understood immediately what that meant. "They'll try to silence you." I looked out at the rain, watching it streak down the glass, each drop reflecting the faint light of the base perimeter fence. "I've spent most of my life being silenced," I said. "Maybe it's time I learn how to speak at the right moment." He didn't argue. He didn't have to. When I hung up, the room was dark except for the faint glow of the screensaver, the Aurora insignia, a single white line cutting through black. I closed the laptop and sat back, listening as the thunder rolled closer. The storm outside felt almost personal now, like the world was reminding me that clarity only comes after the noise. Tomorrow, everything would shift again. But for now, in the dim light and the rain's unrelenting rhythm, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Conviction. The Capitol shone under the spring sun, its white dome blinding against a sky so clear it almost mocked the weight in my chest. Every step I took along the marble corridor echoed, measured, steady, the rhythm of someone who had learned long ago that composure could be armor. The doors to the hearing room opened with a hydraulic sigh. Cameras turned as I entered, lenses tracking me like predatory eyes. Reporters whispered my name as though tasting it for the first time. The Silent General. The title had followed me here like a shadow. I walked to the witness stand, my medals glinting under the lights. For years, I'd hidden what I had earned. Today, it was all visible. Not for pride, but for truth. The members of the Defense Committee sat in a row, the long curve of polished oak separating power from accountability. At the center, Clara Maynard. Her face was flawless under the studio lights, makeup precise, smile calibrated. But the way she gripped her pen betrayed her. Even from across the room, I could see the white of her knuckles. The chair struck the gavel once. "General Porter, do you understand why you've been summoned?" I looked around the chamber. Above me, the gallery overflowed with press and civilians, a sea of faces and flashing lights. The air was thick with anticipation, that electric pause before a controlled detonation. "I was called here," I said, because after 25 years of silence, someone finally wanted me to speak. A ripple moved through the room. The chairman gestured to proceed. I placed a single drive on the podium. The screen behind me flickered to life. Grainy footage appeared. Clara and her advisor, Daniel Creed, in a private meeting. Their voices filled the chamber, clear and undeniable. If the Aurora breach leaks, you'll lose your seat. Then we redirect. Let them think Porter did it. People believe what fits their story, and she's built for silence. No one breathed. Even the hum of the lights seemed to vanish. Clara smiled thinly, but her mouth trembled. She tried to speak, her voice catching midway. This is fabricated. She illegally accessed Senate data. No, I said, cutting through her words. What I accessed was the military network she used to sell classified Aurora data to a private contractor. And I have proof. I slid a second folder onto the table. Inside were the traced access logs. Mayan 12, her internal ID. The code glowed on the large monitor behind me, cold and irrefutable. The chamber erupted. Reporters murmured. Members of the committee exchanged sharp whispers. The chairman struck the gavel repeatedly, calling for order. I waited until the noise fell away, then spoke again. My voice slow, deliberate. In 2011, I lost 3 soldiers to a similar breach. The data leak back then was called a technical error. It wasn't. It was carelessness disguised as bureaucracy, and I promised their families no one would die again because truth was inconvenient. My throat tightened, but I didn't let it show. I'm not here for revenge. I continued. I'm here because when a leader trades integrity for optics, innocent people pay the price. Clara stood now, shouting across the table. You're lying! You were always jealous! I met her gaze. Jealousy? No. Clara. Pity. Because you never understood that service doesn't require a camera, it just requires conviction. Her voice faltered. The cameras caught the moment. The glimmer of fury in her eyes replaced by something else. Fear. A senator to my left leaned toward his colleague, whispering urgently. The lights from the press gallery flared as photographers caught every angle, every expression. The chairman cleared his throat, his voice rough. This committee will recess for review. The gavel struck. The sound was final. As I turned to leave, Clara's shoulders sagged. Her pen slipped from her hand, rolling noiselessly across the table. The same hands that once shook mine in false friendship now trembled under the weight of exposure. I walked down the aisle as the cameras clicked like gunfire. Outside, the light hit me full in the face, warm, unfiltered, unjudging. For the first time in years, sunlight didn't feel like scrutiny, it felt like freedom. A week after the hearing, the vote came down. The results flashed across every network. Senator Clara Maynard suspended, pending criminal investigation. For the first time in months, the world fell quiet. No more pundits dissecting my words. No more talking heads debating my intentions. The noise had finally turned inward, consuming the people who had built it. I watched the news from my office in Washington. The headlines scrolled beneath the anchor's voice. No longer the silent general, but the woman who refused to disappear. I didn't know which one felt stranger. Both were stories built around me, and neither were entirely true. That afternoon, James showed up at the Pentagon. I hadn't expected him. He carried a small bouquet of white lilies. Too formal, too fragile for the place we were standing. He looked older somehow. Or maybe it was just guilt changing the shape of his face. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. You don't. I told him. We've both just learned to see people for who they really are. He hesitated. You're not angry with me? I smiled faintly. Anger's for people who still don't understand themselves. We walked through the empty corridor in silence. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed overhead, steady and impersonal. I'd spent half my life in these halls, once believing they were the center of order. Now they just felt like history, polished, but cold. We stopped by the press room, where a television was mounted above the door. The president was speaking from the White House lawn, his voice solemn, deliberate. In times when our nation falters, he said, we are reminded of those who hold their integrity above all else. Today, we honor a citizen who stood firm when it was easier to yield. My name appeared among the commendations. Nomination for the Medal of Honor, Lieutenant General Adeline Porter. James glanced at me, his voice low. You earned this long before today. Maybe, I said, but sometimes the world needs to fall apart before it remembers what's worth rebuilding. The ceremony was held 2 days later on the South Lawn. The air was crisp, the grass impossibly green, the flag snapping sharply in the morning wind. Dignitaries filled the front rows, but beyond the formality, I felt something simpler. Peace. When my name was called, I stepped forward. The sun hit my uniform, glinting off the medals that once stayed locked away. The president's words washed over me, gentle but firm. We honor a woman who fought in silence, who stood her ground when the world around her chose comfort over conviction. He placed the medal around my neck. The ribbon was heavier than I expected, not in weight, but in meaning. As I turned toward the audience, my eyes caught a figure sitting in the back row. Clara. Her hair was tied low, no makeup this time. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. For a moment, she looked like anyone else. No cameras, no titles, no armor. Just a woman sitting under the same sun, stripped of the world she'd once manipulated. After the ceremony, when most people had begun to disperse, she approached me. Her steps were small, her voice almost a whisper. I was wrong, she said. I was afraid that your silence would erase me, but all it did was force me to face what I'd become. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger, only clarity. Silence doesn't destroy. Clara, empty words do. She lowered her head, nodding once. For the first time, she spoke without performance. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was cleansing. When she walked away, I didn't watch her go. I didn't need to. Some endings don't demand witnesses. As I stood there, the medal catching the last glint of sunlight, I felt something shift inside. The kind of peace that doesn't come from victory, but from release. For years, I'd believed honor was about being recognized. Today, I understood it was about being whole. I looked toward the horizon, where the wind stirred the flags above the White House, and let out a slow breath. The fight was over, not because justice had triumphed, but because the truth no longer needed to hide. Clara had lost everything, but so had I. Once. And perhaps that was the point. Some lessons can only be learned when there's nothing left to protect. As I walked down the path leading away from the podium, I caught my reflection in a pane of glass. The same woman, but lighter somehow. No bitterness, no pride. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes the cost of truth is everything you thought you were, but it's worth every loss. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the silent general. I just felt human. A year had passed. The air in Colorado was thinner than I remembered, crisp, clean, and quiet in a way that felt earned. From the window of the small lecture hall, I could see the peaks of Pikes Peak dusted with snow, shining under the morning sun. I wasn't General Porter anymore, just Professor Adeline. The cadets filled the room, 30 of them, sitting tall in their uniforms, eyes clear, untested. The class was called Leadership in Crisis. Fitting, I thought. The kind of lesson no one truly understands until they've lived it. Halfway through the lecture, a young woman with copper-red hair raised her hand. Her voice carried the careful respect of someone afraid to sound naive. Ma'am, what's the hardest mission you've ever had? I smiled. Not at her question, but at its simplicity. Coming home, I said. The room fell silent. 30 faces waiting, not for explanation, but for permission to feel the weight of those words. I walked to the front table and placed a small object on the surface, a worn silver coin, its edges smooth from years of friction. The ghost talon insignia was still faintly visible. What we do, I said, isn't meant to make us known. It's meant to make the world safer for someone who may never know our names. When class ended, the cadets gathered their notebooks, their boots echoing softly against the tile. The red-haired girl lingered near the door, hesitating before stepping forward. Ma'am, she said quietly, you're the reason I applied to this academy. I looked at her, this young woman with the same fire I once carried, and felt something settle inside me. Then don't make my mistake. I told her, don't stay silent when it's time to speak. Outside, the wind cut cold across the campus, but it felt clean, like renewal. From somewhere beyond the mountains came the low thrum of helicopter rotors. Faint, distant, fading. Not a summons anymore, just an echo of a promise kept. I walked through the Hall of Legacy before leaving. Along the wall hung the plaques of those who'd served, those who'd fallen, and those who'd taught others how to stand. At the end of the row was a new addition, bronze and gleaming. Adeline Porter, valor in silence beneath it. An inscription. She taught us that truth speaks loudest when carried with honor. I reached out, brushing my fingertips across the cold metal. The reflection that looked back at me wasn't a soldier or a survivor, just a woman who had lived long enough to make peace with both. For the first time, there was no anger left, no burden, no noise, only stillness, and it felt like freedom.
Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Hopefully every moment in the story has touched your heart, brought you some reflection, some emotion, and hope. Thank you for taking the time to experience it with us, and hope that each next story will always accompany you on your life journey.